The chapel sat in the heart of Blackthorn Asylum, an architectural relic swallowed by time and shadow. Once a place of solace for lost souls, it now existed in a state of quiet decay, the scent of damp wood and old candles lingering in the air like a dying prayer. Its stained glass windows, once vibrant with depictions of saints and miracles, were now faded, their colors blurred as though smeared by ghostly hands. The staff seldom entered. The patients, even in their states of delusion and mania, instinctively avoided it. Something about the place was wrong. The last official sermon held in the chapel had been 5 years ago. Father Mathis, a visiting priest, had insisted on giving Mass despite the reluctance of the asylum's director. Witnesses recalled how the patients had grown unusually quiet that day, their usual murmurs and outbursts reduced to an eerie silence. Some even claimed that they had seen the patients, those typically restrained to their beds, standing perfectly still in their rooms, eyes fixed on the chapel as though listening to something beyond human perception. Father Mathis never left the chapel after that sermon, at least not as the same man. The orderlies found him kneeling before the altar hours later, his hands clasped so tightly in prayer that his knuckles had turned bone white. His lips trembled as he whispered something inaudible over and over. When they touched him, he let out a sound, a noise not of fear or anguish, but something else, something primal and guttural. He was taken away, committed to a facility far from Blackthorn. No one spoke of him again. With his departure, the chapel had been locked. Officially, it was due to safety concerns, rotting pews, unstable flooring, mold creeping up the walls. But those who had worked at the asylum long enough knew the truth. The chapel wasn't just abandoned. It had been left. It was an unspoken rule among the staff that the door remained bolted at all times, its key lost or conveniently forgotten. And yet, the door was open now. Dr. Eliza Warren was the first to notice it during her evening rounds. The door, thick and heavy with iron reinforcements, hung ajar as though it had never been locked at all. A chill spread through her, but she forced herself forward. The rational part of her mind told her there was a logical explanation: an old asylum, shifting foundations, faulty locks. Still, her breath hitched as she stepped inside. The air was different in the chapel. Heavy, not stale, not dusty, just thick as though sound itself struggled to exist there. The rows of pews stretched into the gloom, their wooden surfaces covered in something wet. She dare not touch it. The massive crucifix behind the altar was intact, but the figure of Christ had been defaced. The eyes were gone, not merely scratched out, but hollowed, leaving gaping sockets that seemed to weep streaks of black down the wood. She turned to leave, but movement at the far end of the room caught her eye. A patient. A man sat alone in the front pew, his back perfectly straight, his head bowed. She knew instantly that he wasn't supposed to be there. He wore no patient gown, no restraints, just a simple black suit, outdated and threadbare. She cleared her throat, forcing authority into her voice. "Sir, this area is off limits. How did you get in here?" The man did not move. He sat with his hands clasped together, fingers interlocked in the manner of one deep in prayer. A moment of hesitation passed before Eliza stepped closer, though her every instinct screamed against it. She reached out, her fingertips barely grazing the fabric of his sleeve. The man's head turned abruptly, but not his body. Just the head, slow, deliberate, almost unnatural in its movement. His eyes, glassy and unfocused, locked onto hers. His mouth opened, and in a voice that did not belong to any living thing, he whispered. The sermon never ended. Dr. Eliza Warren's breath caught in her throat. The words the man had spoken, the sermon never ended, hung in the air like a distant echo, though his lips had long since stopped moving. A deep, unnatural silence settled over the chapel, suffocating and absolute. It was the kind of silence that didn't just lack sound, but seemed to consume it. The man's face remained frozen in that eerie half-turn, his glassy eyes reflecting nothing but the dim candlelight. Eliza forced herself to swallow the rising panic in her chest. She had worked in Blackthorn Asylum long enough to know how delusions twisted the minds of its patients. Hallucinations, murmurs of unseen voices, compulsions to speak in cryptic riddles. It was all part of the job. But this was different. This patient wasn't even in the system. There had been no record of anyone matching his description, no reports of an escape, no evidence that he had entered the chapel at all. She took a slow step back, reaching for the radio clipped to her belt. Static, not just interference, nothing. No crackling, no distant voices from the security office, just pure, dead air. The asylum was old, prone to power fluctuations, but her radio had never failed like this before. She pressed the button again, harder this time, as if force alone could summon a response. Still, there was nothing. The patient, or whoever he was, tilted his head slightly, as if listening to something just beyond the threshold of human perception. His lips moved again, but no sound came out. Then, without warning, he stood. It was sudden, too sudden, not the gradual movement of muscles and bones shifting, but as though his body had snapped upright all at once, like a puppet jerked by unseen strings. Eliza stepped back instinctively, her fingers tightening around the radio. The air grew colder. The wetness she had seen on the pews earlier, whatever it was, had begun to drip, forming dark rivulets on the floor. The man took a step forward, his shoes silent against the chapel's stone floor. His mouth moved again, and though no voice accompanied the motion, she could somehow hear the words inside her skull. "You should not be here." Eliza turned sharply, her pulse hammering as she rushed toward the entrance. But the door was gone. The grand, heavy chapel doors, the ones she had seen hanging open just moments before, had simply ceased to exist. In their place was an unbroken wall of aged stone, the same as the rest of the chapel's interior. She reached out, pressing her hands against the surface, expecting to feel wood, hinges, anything. Solid rock. Cold, unmoving, real. Her breathing quickened. No, this wasn't possible. She just walked through those doors. She had seen them, touched them. She turned back toward the pews, her mind scrambling for logic, for explanation. The man was still there, standing in the aisle, watching her. But something had changed. The pews. There were more of them now. The rows of seats had stretched, multiplied, extended far beyond where the chapel's walls should have been. The dim candlelight flickered, barely illuminating the space, and in the distance, at the very back of the impossibly long room, she could make out figures, seated, motionless, facing forward. Their shapes were indistinct, their features obscured by the shadows, but they were there, silent and waiting. The man in the suit smiled, though it was not an expression of warmth. It was something else entirely, something hollow. The sermon never ended, he whispered again. The chapel's single, unlit candle at the altar suddenly ignited on its own, casting flickering light onto the defaced crucifix. Somewhere in the endless rows of pews, something moved. Dr. Eliza Warren's pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out every rational thought. The figures in the pews, too many pews, sat perfectly still, their silhouettes stretching into the murky depths of a chapel that was now larger than it should be. The air was thick, suffocating, pressing against her skin like damp cloth. The only sound was the soft flickering of the single candle at the altar, its flame moving unnaturally, as if something unseen was breathing over it. She forced herself to take a step forward, but the ground fell off. Not stone, not wood, but something softer, something that gave slightly beneath her weight. She didn't look down. She didn't want to look down. The man in the suit remained in the aisle, his head still tilted at an unnatural angle. Though his mouth was motionless, Eliza could still hear his whisper rattling inside her skull, as though her very thoughts had turned against her. The sermon never ended. The figures in the pews moved. Not all at once, not in a synchronized motion, but staggered, as if they were remembering how bodies should behave. Some merely shifted in their seats, their heads jerking upright, as if startled awake. Others turned toward her, not with curiosity, but with recognition, as though she were not a stranger to them, as though they had been expecting her. Her breath hitched. The candle on the altar burned brighter. The wax should have melted by now, but instead it remained pristine, the flame unervingly steady. In its glow, she caught glimpses of the congregation, hollow eyes, stretched lips, faces that flickered between human and something else. Eliza took a step back. The floor moved beneath her. This time, she did look down. A mistake. The chapel floor was no longer stone. It was flesh, pale, veined, and pulsing, a single unbroken surface of writhing skin. A scream crawled up her throat, but she swallowed it, her entire body recoiling. The floor was breathing, the sensation rising and falling beneath her shoes. Her mind fought against it, refusing to accept what her senses screamed was real. Then came a sound. It started deep, a reverberation beneath the skin floor, like something massive stirring beneath the surface. The figures in the pews all turned in unison now, their necks cracking in the silence, their mouths slowly stretching open. The sermon never ended. The whisper did not come from the man in the suit this time. It came from all of them. Eliza turned, frantic, searching for any possible escape. The door was gone. The walls had stretched into darkness. The pews never ended. She was inside something now. Something vast, something ancient. The chapel was no longer just a room. It was a mouth, a gaping throat, and she had stepped willingly into its belly. And it was waking up. Dr. Eliza Warren's mind was unraveling, logic crumbling like dust beneath the weight of what she was seeing. The chapel was no longer a place. It was a thing, something alive, something that knew she was inside it. The floor pulsed beneath her like living tissue, an unnatural warmth radiating from below. The walls stretched outward, pulling into the darkness, their once solid stone surface now shifting, rippling, as though beneath the weight of something unseen. The figures in the pews remained motionless, their hollow eyes locked onto her, mouths slightly open and silent, expectant expressions. They had no need to move, no need to lunge or chase, because she was already trapped, already ensnared within whatever this place had become. The sermon never ended. The voices filled the chapel, overlapping, whispering, reverberating from unseen spaces. They did not come from mouths or throats. They came from the walls, the floor, the very air itself. The phrase was not a message, not a warning, but a truth. Eliza clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms to ground herself. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. She had spent her career studying psychosis, delusions, trauma-induced hallucinations. Her mind was rational, her grasp on reality firm. And yet, the chapel breathed. The flickering candle on the altar burned with an intensity that cast unnatural shadows across the faces of the congregation, distorting their features, stretching them into grotesque masks of devotion. Then, as if responding to some unseen command, the figures in the pews began to rise. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. Their movements were slow, methodical, their limbs stiff and unnatural as they unfolded from their seats. They did not lurch forward, did not stumble toward her like creatures from a nightmare. Instead, they simply stood, waiting, watching. Then a noise, a deep, guttural sound, something massive shifting in the unseen depths beyond the altar. It was not the shuffling of feet or the rustle of fabric. It was breathing, a long, drawn-out inhalation, as though something ancient was pulling air into lungs that had not expanded in centuries. The candle's flame flared violently. The chapel trembled. Then, from the darkness behind the altar, a door appeared. It had not been there before. Eliza was certain of that. The wooden frame was old, cracked, carved with symbols she did not recognize. It seemed to pulse with the same unnatural rhythm as the floor beneath her feet. Unlike the vanished entrance behind her, this door did not promise escape. It was an invitation, and she was no longer sure if she had a choice. Dr. Eliza Warren's breath came in short, ragged gasps as she stared at the impossible door. It loomed behind the altar, its wooden frame ancient, gnarled, and covered in deep carvings that pulsed like veins beneath stretched skin. It hadn't been there before. It couldn't have been. And yet, it stood waiting as if it had always belonged. Behind her, the congregation stood unmoving, their hollow eyes reflecting the candle's unnatural glow. They were patient, not lunging, not advancing, because they didn't need to. The chapel itself was alive, a thing that shifted and breathed, and it had already swallowed her whole. She turned back to the door. Everything in her screamed, "Do not open it." There was no logic left to apply, no psychological framework that could explain what she was seeing. If she had truly lost her mind, then she was drowning in a delusion so intricate it had rewritten the laws of reality. But if she hadn't, if this was real, then stepping through that door meant crossing into something far worse. Then came the voice. Dr. Warren. It wasn't the whisper of the congregation this time. It wasn't layered or disembodied. It was specific, aimed at her alone. It came from the other side of the door. Eliza stiffened. "You've come so far." The voice was familiar. Too familiar. It was her own voice. The chapel shuddered, the walls stretching impossibly, distorting into something less like architecture and more like flesh. The candle's flame twisted, elongating, reaching toward her as if trying to guide her forward. The figures in the pews remained still, heads slightly tilted, as though waiting for her response. Eliza took a step back. The floor pulsed beneath her, trying to hold her in place. The door rattled. Something on the other side wanted her to open it. Her own voice spoke again, but this time it was different. It came not from beyond the door, but from the congregation itself. Hundreds of voices, all hers, overlapping, whispering, urging. "Eliza." "Dr. Warren." "Open it." Her stomach twisted. The air was thick with something unspeakable, something she could feel pressing against her skin, curling around her thoughts, trying to mold her into something else. And then the door creaked open on its own. Beyond it, there was only darkness. But in that darkness, something was moving, and it was waiting for her to step inside. Dr. Eliza Warren stood at the precipice of the doorway, her own breath swallowed by the dense silence beyond it. The darkness inside was unlike anything she had ever seen. Not a simple absence of light, but a void, a living abyss that seemed to pulse and shift. Something was in there, something that had been calling her, speaking in her own voice. Behind her, the chapel remained frozen in its grotesque reverence. The congregation of hollow-eyed figures had not moved, but their presence pressed against her, suffocating. The air was thick, heavy with something not meant for human lungs. The candle's elongated flame flickered wildly, casting shadows that didn't belong to the objects in the room. Eliza's hands trembled. Every rational instinct in her mind told her to run, to turn back, even if the entrance had already sealed itself, even if there was no way out. Anything was better than stepping forward. And yet, her feet moved. The moment she crossed the threshold, the chapel behind her collapsed into silence. The candle was snuffed out in an instant. The whispering congregation ceased, and the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening boom. She was alone. The darkness was not total. A faint, flickering glow, like dying embers, pulsed deep within the void, illuminating jagged shapes that twisted and shifted as if they were breathing. The air smelled of something acrid and ancient, burnt wood, rusted metal, something else she couldn't quite name. Then the whisper returned. "You're finally here." Eliza's breath hitched. It was her voice. The glow intensified, revealing a shape ahead, a figure. It stood several feet away, barely visible in the dim light, its form distorted, unnatural. But there was no mistaking it. It was her. Dr. Eliza Warren stared at herself, standing in the middle of the void. But the thing wearing her form was wrong. Its head tilted too far to one side. Its limbs were slightly off, its features stretched in ways that made her stomach churn. The eyes, her own eyes, were pitch black, empty pits that reflected nothing. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said, but its voice was layered, overlapping, not entirely human. Eliza's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't a hallucination. It wasn't a breakdown. Something had been waiting for her, and now she was here. The thing where her face smiled, its lips splitting too wide. "Now we can begin." Eliza Warren stood frozen, her breath shallow and uneven as she stared at the thing that wore her face. The dim glow from the abyss barely illuminated its features, but it was enough. Enough to see the way its mouth curled too wide, the way its skin stretched just a little too thin, the way its empty black eyes seemed to drink in all the light around them. Now we can begin. The voice slithered through the darkness, wrong in ways she couldn't put into words. It was her voice, but distorted, layered, as if 100 versions of herself were speaking at once. The figure took a step forward, its movements liquid, almost boneless. Eliza took a step back. The floor beneath her felt soft, like damp earth, but she didn't dare look down. She kept her eyes locked on the thing in front of her, her mind screaming to make sense of it. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be real. But if it wasn't real, why did she feel the pressure of the void around her? Why did she smell the sharp tang of something metallic in the air? "You've been looking for answers," the figure said, tilting its head at an impossible angle. The sound of bones snapping echoed in the silence, though the figure had not broken. Eliza clenched her fists, trying to steady herself. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice hoarse. "What is this place?" The figure took another step closer. It was only a few feet away now. Too close. "Don't you recognize it?" it asked. And then, slowly, it raised one hand and pressed it against her chest. A sudden, blinding pain exploded in Eliza's skull. Memories, but not hers, rushed through her mind like a flood. Images of corridors she had never walked, of faces twisted in agony, of hands clawing at their own flesh in a chapel that should not have existed. Screams, some familiar, some unrecognizable, echoed inside her head. And through the pain, she saw something else. A door, not the one she had just walked through. Another door, one hidden beneath the hospital, one that had been sealed long before she had ever stepped foot in this place. Her knees buckled, and she gasped, stumbling backward. The figure withdrew its hand, watching her with a strange, curious hunger. "Do you see now?" it whispered. Eliza clutched at her temples, her breathing ragged. She didn't understand, not fully, but she had seen enough to know one thing. There was something worse buried beneath this hospital, and it was waiting to be set free. Eliza staggered back, her head pounding with the weight of the memories or visions or hallucinations or whatever they were that had been forced into her mind. Her breath came in uneven gasps as the thing wearing her face simply watched, its expression unreadable. The void around them pulsed like something alive, a slow, steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of some immense, unseen creature. She tried to push the images away, but the door beneath the hospital remained imprinted on her mind. It was ancient, rusted, covered in symbols that burned into her thoughts even though she didn't recognize them. She knew, somehow, that it was never meant to be opened. But more than that, she knew something else. It had been opened before. Eliza swallowed hard. "What is that door?" she forced out, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure's smile widened. Too much, the corners of its mouth splitting slightly as if the skin were about to tear. "A mistake," it said simply. The answer sent a chill through her, deeper than anything she had felt before. A mistake. Someone had opened it before, and something had come through. Eliza clenched her fists, trying to ground herself. This couldn't be real. None of it. She had to be dreaming or hallucinating or trapped in some kind of psychotic break. And yet, the pain in her skull was real. The smell of decay in the air was real. The heavy, oppressive wrongness in the void around her was very real. "I need to get out of here," she murmured, more to herself than to the thing in front of her. The figure let out a sound, half a laugh, half a breathless, rattling sigh. "You were never meant to leave," it said, stepping closer again. Eliza braced herself, expecting another assault on her mind, but instead, the ground beneath her shifted. The darkness that had surrounded them for what felt like an eternity began to peel away, unraveling like burned paper. The air thickened, bending, distorting. Then, without warning, she was somewhere else. She stumbled, her hands pressing against cold stone. The walls around her were old, damp with moisture, covered in streaks of something too dark to be just water. Dim, flickering lights lined the corridor ahead, rusted lanterns that burned with a weak, sickly glow. The air smelled of rot. Eliza turned, her heart hammering in her chest. The void was gone, so was the thing wearing her face. But the hospital chapel was nowhere in sight. Instead, she was standing in a tunnel deep beneath the hospital. And at the end of the corridor, waiting in the dim light, was the door. Eliza's breath came in shallow gasps as she stared at the door at the end of the tunnel. It loomed in the dim light, a grotesque thing of metal and decay, its rusted surface marred by deep gashes, as if something had clawed at it from the inside. The symbols she had glimpsed in her vision were carved into the metal, twisting, writhing shapes that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. The air was thick here, oppressive, as though the very walls of the tunnel were breathing. The scent of rot clung to everything, soaking into her skin. She took a step forward, her body moving before her mind could scream at her to turn back. Her fingers tingled with an unnatural cold as she raised her hand, stopping just short of the corroded surface. A deep vibration pulsed through the metal, like something alive was waiting just beyond it. "You don't want to do that." The voice came from behind her. Eliza whirled around, her pulse hammering against her ribs. A figure stood at the entrance of the tunnel, shrouded in darkness. The weak lantern light barely illuminated his face, but she could see enough: the sharp angles, the hollow cheeks, the eyes that glowed faintly with something inhuman. He was dressed in an old hospital uniform, but it was stained, torn, and covered in something dark that had dried long ago. "Who?" Eliza began, but the words died in her throat. Because she knew. She had seen his face before. Not in the hospital records, not in any of the photographs lining the corridors, but in the visions forced into her mind. He was one of them, one of the doctors who had been here before. "You opened it, didn't you?" she whispered. The man, if he was still a man, tilted his head. "Not willingly," he said, his voice hoarse, cracked with time. "None of us wanted this." Eliza's skin crawled. The way he spoke, the way his words dripped with something like regret, made her stomach twist. "Then what happened?" she asked. The doctor took a step closer. The air around him seemed wrong, distorted, as if space itself was struggling to contain him. "We thought we could control it," he said. "We were fools." A slow, sick realization crept over Eliza. She looked back at the door, at the gashes in the metal, the deep, burned-in symbols. "You tried to close it," she murmured. The doctor exhaled, his breath rattling in his throat. "We tried," he said, "but some doors don't just open one way." A sudden thud reverberated from the other side of the door. A low, wet, inhuman sound. Eliza's blood turned to ice. Something was still in there, and it was awake. The thud came again, louder this time, as if something large and heavy was pounding against the other side of the door. Eliza's heart raced, her chest tightening as she took a step back. The doctor had gone silent, his eyes fixed on the door, his body taut with what could only be described as fear. The shadows in the tunnel around them seemed to grow darker, swirling in unnatural ways, as though the very air had become saturated with dread. "What's behind it?" Eliza forced herself to ask, her voice barely more than a whisper, afraid that speaking too loudly would make things worse. The doctor didn't answer at first, his gaze never leaving the door. His lips trembled, and for a moment, Eliza thought he might speak, but then a low, guttural whisper slid out from the cracks of the metal door. "It's not ready yet." The voice was chilling in its calmness. It was like an invitation to something terrible, and yet there was an undeniable sense of urgency in it. Eliza's blood ran cold. She glanced at the doctor, her eyes wide with disbelief. The whisper had not come from him. He saw her expression and finally spoke, his voice barely audible, as though he was afraid to speak at all. "It doesn't want to be let out." "Then why open it?" she demanded, though the question was mostly for herself. She already knew the answer: curiosity. Hubris, the eternal human drive to understand what should remain untouched. The doctor's eyes flickered, haunted, as if he had lived through the horrors that had happened here, and had no words left to explain the depth of his own guilt. "We didn't know what we were dealing with," he whispered, almost to himself. "We thought we could control it, contain it." Another thud, this time more desperate. A rattle of chains echoed faintly from beyond the door. Eliza's pulse quickened. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream. But something held her in place, something deeper than fear. The suction of this place, the way it seemed to draw her in and hold her against her will. "Why didn't you leave when you had the chance?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. The doctor shifted uncomfortably. "We couldn't," he said, his voice cracking. "None of us could. We were trapped. Not just physically. There's something about this place, about that door. It doesn't let you go. It feeds on you." Eliza took a step forward, feeling the weight of his words crash into her. She glanced at the door again, feeling an invisible pull toward it. The whispering grew louder now, a series of unintelligible sounds that slithered through the cracks, making her skin crawl. The air was thick, pressing down on her, and she felt as if she were suffocating in the tension that radiated from the door. "Let me help you," she said, the words spilling from her before she could think better of them. She didn't know what she meant by it, but she couldn't stand the helplessness of it all. The doctor looked at her, eyes wild. "There's no help here," he said flatly. "You can't undo what's been done. The only way out is if you're willing to give it what it wants." The silence in the tunnel thickened, and for a moment, Eliza thought the doctor's words hung in the air like a threat. Her breath caught in her throat. "What does it want?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. The doctor's eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, he looked afraid, not of the door, not of the thing inside it, but of her. "You," he said, the words coming out as a rasp. "It wants you." The words hung in the air, unreal, like an electric charge that buzzed just below the surface of Eliza's thoughts. She felt her knees buckle as the full weight of what the doctor had said hit her. "It wants you." She could hear those words echoing through her mind, repeating with a rhythm that made her skin crawl. "It wants you." Her pulse raced, and a cold sweat broke out on the back of her neck. Behind her, the door trembled again, but this time, the sound was different. It wasn't a thud or a bang. It was more like a scraping, something dragging against the metal. A low, elongated sound that reverberated deep into her bones, like something trying to force its way out. The whispering had grown more distinct, fragments of words, voices that sounded like they were speaking in a language that was not meant for human ears. Eliza's breath caught in her throat. What did it mean? What could it want with her? She wasn't anyone special. She was just another lost soul, wandering through the hallways of this place, just like the others. Yet, as she stood there, with the doctor's terrified eyes locked onto hers, she felt a rising sense of dread and something else. A cold certainty. "I don't understand," Eliza said, her voice shaky. She took a cautious step toward the doctor. "Why me? Why would it want me?" The doctor stepped back, his hands shaking. "Because you're the one who can finish it." His eyes darted toward the door, and for a moment, Eliza thought he might break down completely. "It needs you. It needs to complete the cycle." The cycle. Her heart skipped a beat. She didn't know what he meant, but she felt the weight of it, the horrible realization that somehow she had become a part of something far darker than she could have imagined. "Why didn't you leave?" Eliza whispered, her voice barely audible. The question hung in the air between them, but she already knew the answer. The door. The power of it, the force it exerted over the people who came into contact with it. Something about it called to them. Perhaps it wasn't even conscious. Maybe it was just a force, an entity that could only be fed by the ones who were drawn to it. "We couldn't leave," the doctor murmured, his eyes wide and frantic. "None of us could. The door, it doesn't allow you to leave. It claims you. But..." He paused, struggling to find the words. "You, Eliza, you have something they didn't." Her stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" The doctor's lips trembled as he leaned closer, as if the very act of speaking was a kind of betrayal. "You've seen it, haven't you?" Eliza blinked, confused. "Seen what?" "The truth," he said, his voice trembling. "The thing that feeds. The thing that the door holds. It's not a what, it's a who. It's been waiting for someone who can set it free." And you're the key. Eliza felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. She wanted to run. She wanted to scream, to break down and wake up from this nightmare. But there was no escape. Not anymore. The doctor's expression shifted. There was a look in his eyes now. Something dark, something almost relieved. As if the burden of knowing the truth had finally left him. He stepped back, his hand reaching out toward the door. "It will come for you soon," he whispered. "And when it does, you'll have to decide." "Decide what?" Eliza asked, her voice barely a whisper. His eyes flickered to hers one last time. And then he said the words that shattered the fragile hold she had on her sanity. "You will have to choose. You can either open the door, or you can let it consume you." The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Eliza felt her body trembling, as if she were standing at the edge of a precipice, looking down into the abyss. There was no way out, no way back. The door was waiting, and it would take what was owed. The only question was whether she would give it what it wanted, or face the consequences of defying it. Behind her, the whispering grew louder. And then, just as the last remnants of her resistance began to crumble, a low, distorted voice hissed from beyond the door. "It's time." The words lingered in the air like an electric charge that refused to dissipate. "It's time." The voice that spoke from behind the door wasn't human. It sounded ancient, dripping with malice, as though the walls themselves were whispering a verdict, pulling Eliza closer to the precipice. Time. What did it mean? Time for what? Time for her to make a choice? Time for the door to claim her? The weight of the moment pressed down on her chest, suffocating her, until she could barely breathe. The doctor was already backing away, his eyes wide with a kind of frantic disbelief. His body trembled as though he were fighting some unseen force. "You have to make the choice now," he repeated, his voice low and urgent. "There's no time left." Eliza's hands were shaking. Make a choice. She didn't know how to make this decision. Every part of her wanted to turn and flee, but the door, the voice, the thing beyond it, they were all holding her in place. She couldn't even understand what was at stake. What was it that the door wanted? What was the cycle that needed to be finished? The only thing she understood was the overwhelming sense of dread that gripped her, and the fact that she was being dragged into something far beyond her control. The air in the hallway had become thick, almost oppressive. It felt as though the shadows themselves were closing in, shrinking the space between Eliza and the door. She could feel their pull, their whisper, the ever-present sensation that there was something just beyond her comprehension. The others, the doctor spoke again, though his voice was less steady now, filled with a trace of despair. They never had a chance. They couldn't withstand the pressure. The door, it feeds on your weakness, your fear. It doesn't want you to choose, it wants to break you. Eliza's eyes flickered to the door, and she saw something move in the shadows beyond it. A figure, indistinct and shifting like a darkened silhouette, lurking just outside her field of vision. A sound like a deep, drawn-out sigh echoed from within, and she felt an involuntary shiver race down her spine. She took a step back, her mind spinning in a desperate whirlpool of confusion. "Break you." The words repeated in her head. The others hadn't been able to choose, hadn't been able to withstand the pull of the door. They had failed, and now it was her turn. But then, for a moment, the shadows seemed to recede. Eliza's breath caught in her throat as she noticed something, an inscription on the door, something she hadn't seen before. It was faint, almost erased by time, but it was there, a single word carved into the metal. Free. What did it mean? Was this the key? Was it a message, a command, or a question? Eliza's heart began to race again. This time, not out of fear, but from the glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, she could free herself. Free herself from the influence of the door. Free herself from whatever dark presence was lurking beyond. As her hand reached for the cold metal of the door, a flood of memories hit her all at once. The faces of the patients she had met, their vacant expressions, their broken minds. They had all passed through this same door, and now she understood. They hadn't been trapped by their own madness, as the doctors had claimed. They had been entranced, pulled in by something far darker. The true horror was not the illness they had suffered, but the thing that preyed upon their souls. The truth was buried beneath the surface, and she had only scratched it. "What's behind it?" Eliza whispered, almost to herself. She didn't know if she was asking the doctor or the door, but it didn't matter. The question had been asked, and now she had to face it. The doctor didn't answer at first. He was shaking, unable to tear his gaze from the door. "No one who has asked that question has lived to see the answer," he said finally, his voice tight with terror. "And those who try to open it are never the same again." He faltered, swallowing hard. "You may already be too late. It's already reached you." A jolt of realization struck Eliza. She had felt it the moment she had stepped into the building. The door, the whispers, the way her every step felt weighted, as though the place was actively trying to draw her in. All the pieces were starting to fall into place. The door hadn't wanted her then, it had chosen her. Before she could say anything, the voice came again, louder now, an almost unbearable screech that reverberated through her skull. "Free us!" The words were a command, a demand. The air seemed to tremble around them, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Eliza's eyes went wide. She could feel the door pushing back, fighting against her will. There was no turning back now. She was no longer just an observer. She was part of the story, part of the horror. The door had found its next victim. Her fingers closed around the cold metal, and she pulled. The door creaked in protest, and for a split second, Eliza wondered if she could break free of it, if she could even survive what was coming. But the moment she touched the door fully, the world around her began to unravel. The shadows leaped forward, the air thickened, and in the distance, she could hear the sound of something scraping, something hungry. The door opened. The door creaked as it swung open, its groan loud in the otherwise still air. As Eliza stepped across the threshold, the world she knew began to dissolve. The moment her foot crossed the line, a rush of cold, suffocating air slammed into her face, biting at her skin like invisible fangs. It was as if a veil had been lifted from her reality, revealing a world far darker, far more twisted than anything she had encountered in the hospital. On the other side of the door, there was no light, no comforting familiar walls. Only endless blackness, an inky void that stretched far beyond her reach. For a moment, Eliza wondered if she had stepped into another dimension, or perhaps into some twisted corner of her own mind. The atmosphere was heavy, oppressive, as if the very air she breathed was saturated with a force that was determined to break her down. And yet, she couldn't stop herself from moving forward, one step after another. The silence was deafening. There were no sounds of the hospital, no whispers of the voices that had plagued her during her stay. The absence of noise was almost more terrifying than any noise could have been. It was as though the very fabric of existence had been silenced here, leaving her isolated, completely alone in the vast, dark expanse. And yet, Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't truly alone. Something was watching her, something she could feel but not see. As she ventured deeper into the darkness, her senses heightened. The air smelled like decayed earth, and something metallic, blood perhaps. Her heart pounded in her chest, a constant reminder that her mind and body were still in tune with the reality she had left behind, even if the world around her no longer made sense. She could hear her own breathing, shallow and erratic, as though her body was betraying her, urging her to turn back, to leave this place. But there was no turning back. The door had already closed behind her, sealing her fate. And then, the ground beneath her feet began to shift. It wasn't a subtle change. It was as if the very floor was twisting, contorting, as though the world around her was alive, breathing with a life of its own. Eliza stumbled, trying to regain her balance, but the sensation of movement was overwhelming. It was as though the floor was undulating, pulling her deeper into the abyss with each passing second. Suddenly, a light flickered in the distance, faint at first, like a star on the horizon, but it grew brighter, stronger. Eliza's instincts screamed at her to run, to flee from whatever lay ahead, but her feet carried her toward the light, each step reluctant, yet compelled by some invisible force. As she drew closer, The light grew more intense, blinding her for a moment. And then, as though the light had a will of its own, it split open, revealing a cavernous room beyond. The space was vast, too large for her to comprehend, and at the center stood a figure. A person, no, not a person, but something more, something other. It was as though the being were made of the very shadows that surrounded them, a mass of undulating darkness, with eyes glowing like embers. It spoke, its voice deep and resonant, filling Eliza's mind like a dark thunderstorm. "You have come." The words were not a greeting. They were a declaration, an inevitability. Eliza stood frozen, her mind racing, her heart hammering in her chest. She had no idea what this thing was or what it wanted from her. Was it the force that had been haunting her all this time? Was it the one behind the door? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. The pressure in the room was too intense, too overwhelming. "You do not understand," the figure continued, its voice cutting through her thoughts. "You never did, but now you will." The figure stepped forward, and Eliza's breath caught in her throat. As it moved, the shadows around it seemed to stretch and writhe, as though they were alive. The light, once bright and blinding, flickered again, casting strange, erratic shadows that seemed to twist and distort into grotesque shapes. Eliza's eyes darted around the room, her panic growing. And then she realized the shadows were not just shadows. They were faces, hundreds of faces, all frozen in expressions of terror, their eyes wide with agony. Their mouths were open, but no sound came from them. They were trapped within the shadows, their forms flickering in and out of existence as though they were never meant to be real. And yet, they were. They were the victims, the souls of those who had come before her, each one trapped, tortured, and now frozen in this dark, hellish prison. Eliza staggered backward, her hands reaching for something to steady herself. She could feel the weight of their gaze, their silent pleas, pressing down on her, suffocating her. She was one of them now, wasn't she? Trapped, doomed to spend eternity in this wretched place. But the figure wasn't finished. It moved closer, the shadows parting around it like water. Its eyes burned into her, and she felt her body begin to tremble uncontrollably. "You will become like them," it said softly, almost lovingly. Just another face in the shadows, lost to time, forgotten by the world you once knew. Eliza couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The words were a death sentence, a reality she had never imagined, and yet they made sense. She was already here. She had already crossed the threshold. There was no going back. The figure smiled, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, showing teeth that were too sharp to belong to any living creature. Eliza's scream echoed through the cavern, but it was swallowed up, absorbed by the shadows. And the door behind her was gone. Eliza stood in the suffocating void, the presence of the figure still lingering in her mind, its cryptic words etched into her thoughts like a scar. She could still feel the cold touch of its gaze, the overwhelming weight of the shadows pressing against her chest, as though the very air had become a cage around her. The room, or whatever this place was, seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, offering no escape, no way to comprehend the scale of the horror that enveloped her. She was trapped, both physically and mentally, caught between a past she could no longer remember clearly and a present that seemed to be slipping further from her grasp. What had begun as an ordinary day in the hospital had morphed into something far more sinister, a nightmare so far beyond the realm of reason that Eliza could hardly cling to any sense of reality. The very walls of the chapel, the floor beneath her feet, the air she breathed, all felt like a twisted mockery of the place she had once known. Time no longer flowed in any discernible rhythm. Seconds felt like hours, and hours like seconds. The dark figure, that grotesque being, had left her standing alone in the center of this vast, blackened room. Yet it remained with her in some twisted form, echoing through her thoughts. "You will become like them." Those words continued to reverberate in her mind, clawing at her sanity. What did it mean? What was she becoming? Everywhere Eliza turned, she was met with the twisted faces of the souls trapped in the shadows. Their silent, pleading eyes haunted her, unblinking and eternal. Were they once like her? People who had walked these halls, people who had suffered as she did, now twisted into these horrible, spectral forms? Or had they always been a part of this place from the very beginning? The realization began to dawn on her with a sickening certainty. There was no escape. A sharp, sudden pain shot through Eliza's chest, as if her heart had been squeezed by an unseen hand. She gasped, trying to steady herself, but the darkness around her seemed to shift, pulse, and press in closer. Her thoughts, once rational and ordered, had become disjointed, fragmented. She could feel her mind beginning to unravel, the edges of her consciousness fraying like a thread coming loose from a worn-out fabric. It wasn't just the fear that gnawed at her. It was the suffocating feeling that she had lost something important, and she couldn't remember what it was. Was it her sanity? Or something more fundamental, something that had tied her to the world outside this abyssal prison? She couldn't remember. She could hardly remember anything at all. The hospital, the people she had known, the chapel. Everything was slipping away from her grasp, like sand running through her fingers. It was as if this place didn't just distort the physical world, it was eating away at her very identity. In a desperate, frantic attempt to ground herself, Eliza reached out, her hand brushing against the wall of shadows. But the moment her fingers made contact, she recoiled, her skin burning as though she had touched something far hotter than she could have imagined. She gasped, staring down at her hand, which was now seared with an unearthly glow. What was this place? What was happening to her? As her panic reached a fever pitch, she staggered forward, the overwhelming need to escape becoming her only focus. The walls around her seemed to close in, and with each step, she felt a strange, ethereal force pushing her deeper into the labyrinth of this nightmare. The more she tried to fight it, the more it seemed to pull her, as if the shadows themselves were alive, hungry, and determined to swallow her whole. Her breath was coming in ragged, shallow gasps, and with every step, her legs began to shake. This wasn't just fear. This was something far worse, something primal that clawed at her insides. Her own body seemed to be betraying her, weakening with every passing second. She could feel the pull of the shadows growing stronger, their suffocating grip tightening around her chest. And then, just when she thought she couldn't go any further, a sound echoed through the room, a low, distorted whisper. "Eliza." She froze, her body seizing in place. The voice wasn't the figure's voice, nor was it any of the trapped souls that surrounded her. It was familiar, too familiar. Her own name, spoken in a tone that was both comforting and horrifying at once. The sound felt as though it was coming from deep inside her own mind, like a memory she had forgotten but was now being dredged up against her will. It was a voice she recognized. But who? The shadows around her seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, almost as though the room itself was alive, responding to the call. The whisper came again, louder this time, almost as if it were inside her head. "Eliza, you know me, don't you?" For a brief moment, the oppressive weight of the room seemed to lift, and in that split second, Eliza thought she glimpsed a figure, a shadowy form standing at the far edge of the room, just beyond the light's reach. The figure was tall, its features obscured by the thick darkness, but something about it felt familiar. Could it be someone she knew? She took a tentative step forward, and the shadows seemed to part for her, allowing her to move toward the figure. It was as though the darkness itself had recognized her resolve, parting to make way for what was coming next. Each step felt like an eternity, and with each passing moment, Eliza could feel the last remnants of her strength beginning to fail her. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and she found herself reaching for the figure, desperate for something, anything, that might help her understand what was happening. But as she closed the distance between them, the figure suddenly turned, revealing a face that froze her blood. It was her own face, but twisted, distorted, and monstrous. Her own reflection, but it was not her. The eyes were empty, hollowed-out sockets, and a wide, cruel grin stretched across the face. Eliza's heart skipped a beat. This was no salvation. This was a trap. The reflection spoke again, its voice now unmistakably Eliza's own. You were always meant to be here. You were always meant to become one of us. The darkness closed in around her once more. Eliza stood motionless, her body paralyzed by a sense of dread, so consuming it threatened to erase her very identity. The twisted reflection of herself, its empty eyes and malevolent grin, loomed before her, its voice ringing in her ears like an unwanted confession. The words repeated themselves over and over in her mind, each echo reverberating deeper into her psyche. You were always meant to be here. You were always meant to become one of us. The air around her thickened, and her chest tightened as though the very atmosphere conspired to suffocate her. But what did it mean? Her mind, already stretched to its breaking point, struggled to make sense of it all. She was not the same person she had been when she first entered this place, this horrifying chapel of lost souls. Everything around her, from the oppressive shadows to the whispers of the damned, was slowly transforming her, twisting her into something else. Eliza felt herself being pulled inward, as if the shadows were calling her to surrender her soul to their endless depths. The figure before her, the twisted mirror image, spoke again, its voice dripping with cruel certainty. You've always been one of us, Eliza. From the moment you stepped through those doors, you were bound to this place. You just didn't know it yet. A wave of nausea gripped her. She couldn't remember everything, but she could feel it, the deep, insistent pull of the chapel, like some invisible force tethering her to the endless night that surrounded her. Had she been destined for this all along? Was this why she had been drawn to the hospital, to this chapel in the first place? Or was this the culmination of something far darker, something that had been waiting for her? Her body trembled in fear, and her mind raced, unable to make sense of the dissonant thoughts colliding within her. No, she whispered, her voice trembling. This isn't me. I'm not one of you. But even as she spoke the words, Eliza felt the truth slipping through her fingers, like water that couldn't be held back. The reflection of herself seemed to swell and grow, its features becoming more grotesque with each passing second. Her own voice now mocked her, repeating her words in a twisted, mocking tone. I am not one of you. I am not one of you. It was then that Eliza realized something chilling. The reflection wasn't just a mirror of her physical form. It was an expression of her innermost fears and doubts. The more she resisted, the more it grew, feeding on the fragility of her resolve. Her very self was being pulled apart, its integrity shattered piece by the force of the darkness. She stumbled backward, trying to break free, but the chapel seemed to close in around her. The air felt thicker, heavier, as though the space itself was alive and trying to crush her. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, their voices swirling around her like a torrent. You cannot escape, they hissed. You have always belonged to the shadows. Eliza's heart pounded in her chest. She had to escape. She couldn't let herself become like the others, trapped forever in this nightmare of twisted souls. She searched for an exit, for any sign of a way out, but the walls were featureless, stretching into an infinite darkness. There was nowhere to run. She was surrounded by the very thing that sought to consume her, and the truth of her situation was beginning to settle over her like a shroud. There was no escape. Suddenly, a sharp, distinct sound broke through the cacophony, the faintest of whispers, but one that cut through the rest with chilling clarity. Remember who you are. The voice was different this time. It wasn't the mocking tones of the reflection or the malevolent whispers of the shadows. This voice, soft, familiar, almost maternal, held a strange sense of comfort. Eliza froze, every muscle in her body tensing as the words sank in. Remember who you are. Was it possible? Could she reclaim herself, her identity, and escape this nightmare? In that moment, the chapel seemed to shift, the oppressive weight lifting just enough for Eliza to take a breath. She closed her eyes, focusing on the voice that had spoken to her. Remember who you are. Her thoughts began to fragment once more, but she grasped onto that voice like a lifeline in a storm. And then, as if the chapel itself had responded to her desire for escape, the walls seemed to crack, faint lines of light seeping through the cracks. They illuminated the dark corners of the room, revealing glimpses of what had once been hidden in the shadows. Figures, faint and indistinct, moved among the darkness, their forms barely perceptible. Were they like her, trapped souls waiting to be freed? Or were they something far worse, lost to the same fate as the twisted reflection she had faced? The light flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the room, and Eliza took a tentative step forward. It was a small step, but it felt monumental. The voice that had guided her continued to resonate in her mind, and Eliza understood now. Her strength lay not in escaping the darkness, but in confronting it, in remembering who she was before the shadows had taken hold of her. The oppressive weight of the room seemed to press in once more, but Eliza stood taller, her body no longer trembling with fear. She wasn't sure what awaited her in the shadows, but one thing was certain: she had a choice. And for the first time since she had arrived in this forsaken chapel, Eliza knew that she could fight back. Her mind cleared, and the mirror of truth, the twisted version of herself, faded into the distance, its presence no longer overwhelming her. Eliza's heart beat faster, but now it was a rhythm of resolve, not of fear. She was no longer just a prisoner of the darkness. She was a challenger, and with each step she took, she would find her way out, no matter what the chapel threw at her next. The whispers were gone. For a brief moment, Eliza stood in the eerie silence, her breath slow and deliberate, her senses heightened as she listened for the faintest trace of sound. Her surroundings had shifted once more, the oppressive darkness that had once closed in around her now receding into a distance that felt almost foreign. The chapel was still there, its cracked stone walls and rotting pews, the haunting stain of decay spread across the cold floor. But something had changed. The atmosphere no longer felt suffocating. It felt like a beginning, but Eliza was not fooled. She had faced many moments in her life where something seemed like an end, only to be greeted with a more insidious twist. The uncertainty of this place still lingered, waiting for her to slip, waiting for her to misstep. Yet, as she gazed at the cracked walls, an unsettling calm washed over her. She had learned something valuable in her previous moments of darkness. The road to freedom was never linear. Freedom, she realized now, was a paradox. It was not something that would be handed to her, but something that would demand a confrontation, a battle of will, of mind, and of the very essence of who she was. The voice that had spoken to her, the voice that had guided her, gently reminding her of who she was, had not been some divine intervention, but a reflection of the power that resided within her. Eliza was learning that in order to navigate this broken place, she would need to trust herself more than ever before. Her steps echoed loudly as she moved through the chapel, the sound jarring in the silence, as though the space itself was holding its breath. Her gaze shifted to the altar at the far end of the room. It was unlike the others she had encountered before. The symbols carved into the stone surface were unfamiliar, their meaning unclear but undeniably ancient. In the dim light, she could make out faint impressions of twisted shapes, symbols that seemed to writhe under her gaze, too grotesque to interpret clearly. The chapel had never been just a building. It was a conduit, a place where the rules of the world bent, twisted, and distorted. Every inch of it seemed designed to pull its visitors deeper into its grip to break them. But something within Eliza's core told her that the answers lay before her. The altar seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as if it had been waiting for her to come closer. As she approached, her hand hesitated over the stone surface, hovering just above the intricate carvings. This was it, the moment where the boundaries between reality and nightmare would finally collapse. She took a deep breath and allowed her hand to settle onto the cold stone. The moment her skin made contact, the air around her seemed to vibrate, and the room grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. A faint hum filled the room, a sound so low and primal it resonated deep within her chest. The altar did not react with violence, as she feared it might, but rather, it seemed to accept her touch. The carvings on the stone began to glow faintly, an eerie green light emanating from the symbols. They shifted and reformed, a grotesque dance of shadows that seemed to crawl beneath the surface of her vision. It was as though the chapel itself was coming alive, aware of her presence, and acknowledging her role in whatever twisted game it was playing. Eliza's heart raced, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she focused, her mind sharpening with each passing second. The journey she had embarked on had led her here, and she couldn't afford to turn back. She needed to know what lay behind this charade. She needed to understand the truth of this place, and of herself. The hum grew louder, and the light from the altar intensified, illuminating the once dark corners of the room. In that light, Eliza could finally see the figures in the shadows, ghostly shapes that seemed to fade in and out of existence, their forms barely holding together. They were the souls of the lost, the ones who had succumbed to the chapel's power. The same power that had nearly consumed her, the power that twisted and contorted everything it touched. But there was something else in their gaze. Recognition. The figures, though flickering in and out of view, watch her closely, their eyes filled with something far deeper than despair. They seemed to know who she was. They were not mere victims of the chapel. They were its guardians. And they, too, were waiting for something. With a surge of adrenaline, Eliza realized what she had to do. She had come this far, and there was no turning back. The voice had been right. The road to freedom was not a straight path. There would be moments of doubt, moments where the darkness would try to claim her, but she was stronger now, stronger than she had ever been before. The air grew thick again as the altar's glow intensified, and Eliza knew what she had to do. She lifted her hands from the stone, but as she did, the room seemed to recoil, the shadows lengthening, almost as if the chapel was displeased by her decision. But Eliza would not be controlled. She took a final glance around the chapel, the figures in the corners seeming to watch her with resigned sorrow, their existence forever tied to this cursed place. For a moment, Eliza felt a pang of guilt, a fleeting sense that perhaps she had abandoned them. But it was fleeting because she knew now that in order to escape, she had to sever all ties. She could not save them. She could only save herself. With one final, resolute step, Eliza turned and walked toward the exit. The door that had once been locked, the door that had been hidden beneath layers of dark energy, now stood open, as if it had always been waiting for her to find the courage to leave. The chapel behind her shuddered, the walls groaning in protest. The whispers returned, louder this time, trying to pull her back, to drag her into their endless cycle of torment. But Eliza didn't stop. She didn't look back. With every step she took toward the open door, the grip of the chapel loosened, its hold on her slipping like a forgotten nightmare, fading from the edges of her consciousness. The light grew brighter, blinding her with its purity as the door grew nearer. She was free, or at least free from the grip of the chapel. And as she stepped across the threshold, she could hear the whispers finally fall silent behind her, as though the chapel had conceded its defeat. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Eliza had learned something crucial during her time in the darkness. She had the power to choose, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she chose to move forward. The moment Eliza stepped out of the chapel, she felt a strange sensation wash over her. At first, it was the familiar weightlessness of escaping a nightmare, the oppressive air of the chapel now far behind her. The reality she had known before entering this forsaken place seemed to pulse at the edges of her perception. But then something shifted. The world before her was not the world she had left. The landscape had changed. She stood in a vast, barren field, the sky above painted in hues of red and orange that should have been impossible for any sunset. There were no clear signs of life, no trees or animals, just a stark and unyielding expanse of cracked earth beneath her feet. The wind, once comforting, now howled through the emptiness, carrying with it an unsettling silence, as though the land itself were holding its breath. The horizon stretched endlessly, its edges merging into the distance where reality itself seemed to blur and fade. Eliza blinked, trying to focus on the world around her. Was this still the realm of the chapel? Was she trapped in another illusion, another twisted layer of this labyrinth of horrors? She could feel the pulse of something ancient beneath her feet, something waiting, watching. The ground beneath her was not just earth. It was alive in its own way, like the pulse of the chapel had bled into this new world. The path forward was not clear, but she knew instinctively that there was only one way forward. She had crossed the threshold, but the door behind her was gone now, replaced by the vast emptiness. Her mind raced. How had she gotten here? Had she truly escaped? Or was this just another extension of the same nightmare? The weight of her choices loomed over her, but Eliza pushed the doubt aside. There was no turning back now. She had made it through the chapel. This place, whatever it was, couldn't be worse than the confines of its walls. She began walking. With each step, she felt herself sinking deeper into the strange, surreal world she now found herself in. The earth beneath her feet seemed to shift, as if the ground itself had a mind, adjusting to her movements, testing her presence. She felt the subtle pressure of the land under her shoes, each step an eerie reminder that she was not alone, that whatever inhabited this place had been waiting for her. As Eliza walked further into the barren field, her mind turned over the events that had led her here. The chapel had been a maze of illusions, a twisted hall of mirrors, reflecting her darkest fears and desires. But something had shifted within her. The whispers, the haunting figures, all of it. They were no longer enough to trap her. Her ability to question, to doubt, had become her strength. Perhaps that was the key all along. She had believed the chapel to be an impenetrable prison, but in reality, it had been her mind, her own limitations, that had imprisoned her. As the wind whipped around her, Eliza caught sight of something unusual in the distance. A flicker of light, like a faraway star in the murky sky. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it pulled at her like a thread, guiding her through the vast emptiness. Was this a sign? Another trap laid out before her, or a genuine beacon leading her to freedom? Instinctively, Eliza moved toward it. The field stretched on endlessly, yet the light remained fixed, just out of reach but always within her sights. The closer she came, the more the light seemed to grow, like a slow-burning flame catching her attention, drawing her in with promises of answers, of clarity. She didn't question why it had appeared or why it was waiting for her. After everything she had encountered, every twist, every turn, she had come to accept that the rules of this place were not hers to dictate. She could only follow, step by step, and hope that her choices would lead her to the truth. The more she walked, the more the light pulsed, steady and unwavering. But the land around her was changing too. The cracks in the earth grew wider, jagged, as though something deep below was stirring, waking up after a long slumber. She could feel the pressure building, like the earth itself was reacting to her presence. With each step forward, she noticed a change in the atmosphere, a subtle shift in the air that sent a chill down her spine. This was no ordinary journey. This was the crossing of thresholds. Eliza's heart raced, not out of fear, but out of anticipation. What awaited her at the end of this unseen path? Was it an escape, or had the journey just begun? The questions swirled, but she silenced them, focusing solely on the light ahead. Whatever it was, she would face it. There was no other option. The path to freedom was never meant to be easy, but she had already proven that she was capable of overcoming the impossible. And this light, this strange beacon in the desolate field, was the next step, the next challenge. And so Eliza walked. The field stretched on, the air thick with the sense of something unseen but ever-present. With each step, the tension within her body grew, not from fear, but from the realization that she was moving closer to something that could either release her or trap her forever. The pulse of the land beneath her feet grew stronger, the hum of an unseen force vibrating through her skin, urging her forward. This strange, unfamiliar path was hers to walk now, and no matter what lay ahead, she would not falter. She had come too far to turn back. Eliza stood at the edge of the vast field, where the strange light she had followed flickered like a dying star in the distance. The land around her, with its cracked and barren earth, had taken on a more foreboding presence. The air was heavy now, thick with the scent of something long decayed, a sharp reminder that whatever force lay ahead, it was not one to be underestimated. The path, though clear in her mind, was fraught with tension, as though the very landscape itself was bracing for her next move. As she walked closer to the source of the light, Eliza felt an odd sense of dissonance. The world around her seemed to oscillate, as if caught between two realities, neither quite stable. Her feet sank further into the shifting earth, and the landscape blurred at the edges, as though the fabric of space was unraveling before her eyes. The more she advanced, the less she was sure of what was real and what was a manifestation of her own fractured mind. The light before her grew, but so did the strange sounds that filled the air, a low hum, vibrating through the very air she breathed. It was not just the sound of wind, but something deeper, older, a hum that seemed to come from the ground itself, vibrating with an unearthly force. It pulled at her chest, as if the world around her was beckoning her to understand something beyond her comprehension. With each step forward, the hum became louder, more distinct. It was as though the earth was alive, conscious of her presence, aware of her every movement. And then it stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, as though the world itself had exhaled, waiting for her next action. Eliza froze. The ground beneath her had ceased to shift. The air no longer carried the pulsating tension. It was as if everything had come to a halt. A cold breeze swept through the field, but it was not the kind of chill that simply cooled the skin. This was the kind of cold that seeped into the bones, a reminder that some things were far colder than the absence of warmth. Eliza could feel it deep in her core, as though the very land was trying to make her understand something. It was then that she realized the truth. The light she had been following, the beacon that seemed like an escape, was not guiding her toward freedom. It was pulling her closer to the heart of this strange, fractured world, into the very essence of its darkness. She had been led here, not by chance, but by the same force that had shaped every twist and turn of her journey. The light, the path, even the hum, all of it had been orchestrated, set in motion to bring her to this moment. The realization hit her with a force she had not expected. This had all been a test. The chapel, the field, the shifting landscape, everything was a reflection of her own psyche, of her deepest fears and desires. She had believed she was escaping, but what if there was no escape? What if this place, this nightmare, was not an external force, but an internal one, an endless loop of her own making? The thought sent a shiver through her spine. Could it be true? Could everything she had experienced up to this point simply be the manifestation of her mind, unable to let go? Her mind raced with possibilities, but there was no time to dwell on them. The silence around her deepened, oppressive and thick, like a weight pushing against her chest. She had to move forward, but now, the uncertainty that had once been a distant echo had become her constant companion. The world had shifted again, and this time, the path was not as clear as before. The light was still there, flickering, but it no longer offered comfort or reassurance. It was a lure, a call to venture deeper into the unknown. Eliza forced herself to take another step. Each movement felt heavier now, as though the air itself was fighting against her. But she could not stop. Not now. Not after everything. Her feet carried her forward, but the landscape had begun to change again. The earth had become softer, the cracks more pronounced, as though something was waiting to emerge from below. The light had taken on a new hue, shifting from the faint flicker of before to a brilliant, almost blinding glow. And then she saw it. At the center of the light, emerging from the shifting earth, was a figure, a dark silhouette, familiar yet distant. Its shape twisted and distorted with every blink, and for a moment, Eliza thought she saw a reflection of herself within it, a distorted image, warped and shattered. The figure moved closer, its form unrecognizable, yet its presence unmistakable. This was no external force, no entity to confront. This was something within her, something she had been avoiding, something that had been waiting to be faced. The truth was undeniable now. The chapel, the field, the light, it was all a manifestation of her own mind, each piece an expression of her fears, her regrets, her doubts. The figure before her was not a threat, but a reflection of her unresolved self. To move forward, to truly escape, Eliza would have to confront it, face the parts of herself she had long ignored. And with that understanding, the weight on her chest began to lift, but the road ahead remained uncertain, the path now one of self-discovery. Eliza took a deep breath, her heart pounding in her chest. The real challenge had just begun. Eliza stood, frozen in place, staring at the figure emerging from the shifting earth. The light that had guided her to this point now felt like a memory, an illusion of safety that had slowly morphed into a harbinger of something much darker. The figure, her reflection, or something much older and more fragmented, loomed before her, its outline wavering like smoke, just out of reach, yet undeniably present. The air was thick with tension, the once familiar hum now replaced by an unnerving silence that swallowed everything around her. It was not the first time Eliza had been confronted by her fears, but this felt different. The figure before her wasn't simply a manifestation of her doubt or insecurity. It was a mirror, a distorted version of herself, embodying everything she had tried to escape. The twisted figure seemed to mock her, shifting and contorting, as if it knew the deepest corners of her mind, the places she had buried long ago. And there was no running from it. This time, there was no external force to blame. This was her deepest self, laid bare in front of her. The realization of this truth hit Eliza like a wave, drowning her in a mixture of terror and revelation. She had been so focused on escaping this place, on finding a way out, that she had never once stopped to consider why she was here in the first place. This place, this fractured, decaying world, was not a punishment, but a result of her own mind unraveling. It was her subconscious refusing to let go of the unresolved pain, the guilt, the shame that she had carried with her all her life. Every step of her journey had been shaped by these emotions, by the fragments of herself she refused to confront. The chapel, the field, the light, they were all part of the same cycle. A cycle she had been running from, thinking that if she could just reach the end, she could escape the truth. But there was no end, no escape. The truth was not something to be outrun. It was something to be faced, embraced, understood. Her mind raced with thoughts, each more urgent than the last. Could she face this version of herself? The one who had made mistakes, the one who had failed, the one who had carried so much unresolved grief? Could she reconcile with the parts of her that she had abandoned? Or was this her punishment? This endless loop of self-doubt and denial? As the figure grew closer, Eliza felt a sharp pang in her chest. It wasn't just the weight of guilt or regret. It was something more visceral, something rooted deep within her. The figure's eyes, though unrecognizable, seemed to see right through her, into the core of her being. It wasn't judging her. It was simply waiting for her to make the choice she had been avoiding. And that's when it hit her, the final choice. For all the twists and turns, all the trials and horrors she had faced, this was the one decision that would determine everything: to continue running, to stay trapped in this cycle, or to face the truth, to accept the darkness within herself and move forward. The silence around her was deafening. Eliza's heart beat erratically in her chest, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. But there was no time left. The figure before her seemed to shift once more, not in shape but in essence. Its form blurred, fractured, a reflection of her internal chaos. It was as if it were calling her to finally choose, to accept or reject what had been hiding in the shadows. Her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the weight of her past, the unresolved memories, the parts of herself she had tried to forget. But she couldn't keep running. Not anymore. She had to face it, all of it, the good, the bad, and the ugly. For in accepting her full self, she would be free. Not from this place, but from the prison she had built within her own mind. With one final breath, Eliza stepped forward toward the figure. As her foot met the shifting earth, the figure reached out, its form dissolving into the air around her, no longer separate from her, but becoming part of her. The hum that had once felt oppressive was now a song of understanding, resonating within her soul. The chapel, the light, the field, they all began to fade, not into darkness but into light. A light not born of escape, but of acceptance. Eliza had made her choice. The cycle was broken, not because she had found a way out, but because she had finally embraced the truth within herself. She could feel the weight lifting, the burden of her past dissolving as she stood there in that space between worlds. The journey had not been about finding a way out of the nightmare, but about realizing that the nightmare was never external. It was within her all along. And in that realization, Eliza understood the final truth. The only way out was in. As the remnants of the chapel faded into the ether, Eliza found herself standing in the same field where it all began. But this time, everything felt different. The sky was no longer a murky shade of gray, but a pale blue that hinted at the first light of dawn. The earth beneath her feet, once cold and brittle, now felt warm and solid, as though it was alive and welcoming her back into the world. She had stepped through the veil of her own fears, her own guilt, and now she stood in a place that was simultaneously familiar and new. The path forward was uncertain, yet felt right. The oppressive silence that had enveloped her throughout her journey had finally been broken. A soft breeze swept through the field, carrying with it the faint scent of flowers, the kind of fragrance she hadn't realized she had missed. It was a small detail, but it was enough to remind her that she was still alive, still capable of experiencing the world outside the confines of her own mind. The world was waiting for her, but more importantly, she was finally ready to face it. Eliza's thoughts drifted back to the figure she had confronted in the chapel, the distorted reflection of herself. She had feared it, resented it, and tried to run from it. But in the end, that figure had not been her enemy. It had been the part of her that had been locked away, the part that she had spent so long trying to bury. In acknowledging it, in accepting the darkness as part of her, she had finally been able to free herself. It wasn't a perfect solution, nor was it a clean slate, but it was the beginning of something new. The past, with all its pain and mistakes, would never completely disappear. The echoes of her failures would always be there, lurking in the background, reminding her of the fragility of her humanity. But Eliza now understood that those echoes did not define her. They were simply reminders, not chains. And it was in this acceptance that she had found peace. No longer would she be bound by the past, nor would she seek to outrun it. Instead, she would carry it with her, not as a burden, but as a part of her story, a chapter that had led her to this moment of clarity. As she walked through the field, her steps slow and deliberate, she realized that the cycle of fear and denial had ended. She had come full circle, but this time, it wasn't just a return to where she had started. It was a new beginning. The fog that had clouded her mind for so long had lifted, and in its place, there was light. Real light. The kind of light that comes from within, from the understanding that she had faced her darkest fears and emerged on the other side stronger, more whole. She wondered what awaited her in the world beyond this place. Would she be able to pick up the pieces of her life? Would the people she had left behind be willing to accept the person she had become? The questions lingered in her mind, but she no longer felt the overwhelming need to have all the answers. The journey had taught her that life was not about perfection or resolution. It was about growth, about learning to live with uncertainty, and about finding peace with the unknown. Eliza's eyes wandered to the horizon, where the first rays of sunlight were beginning to break through the clouds. She didn't know how long she had been here, lost in her mind, but she knew that the world was still turning, still waiting for her to return to it. She felt a sense of urgency, not out of fear, but out of a newfound desire to embrace the world she had once been so afraid to face. She had spent so much time hiding, so much time retreating into the safety of her own mind, but now she was ready to step forward, to rebuild, and to rediscover the world she had once known. With each step she took, Eliza felt a quiet strength growing within her. She had faced the darkness of her own mind, and while it had been terrifying, it had also been liberating. She understood now that fear was not something to be avoided, but something to be confronted. It was only by confronting fear that she could truly understand who she was and what she was capable of. She had learned that the most important part of her journey was not about defeating the darkness, but about learning to coexist with it. The path ahead was still unclear, but Eliza no longer needed the answers. She was no longer searching for a way out of the nightmare, because she had learned that the nightmare was not something external. It was part of her, and in accepting that, she had found the key to her freedom. She had stopped running, stopped hiding, and for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Eliza's heart felt lighter. The past had not been erased, nor had it been conquered, but she had made peace with it, and that peace was enough. It was enough to face the world once more, to live without the chains of guilt and shame that had once held her captive. The final step in her journey wasn't a physical one. It was a mental and emotional one. And as she looked toward the horizon, she knew that this was only the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where she could finally embrace the world, with all its beauty and its flaws, on her own terms. The cycle had ended. The darkness had been faced. And now, the light had returned.